The speaker is Colonel retired Bob Hervey. He was accepted into the Army's Foreign Affairs Officer Program in 1967. He attended the Turkish language training at the Defense Language Institute in 68 and 69 and earned his master's degree in Middle East Area Studies, Political Science at the University of Utah. He was first assigned to Turkey in 1972, where he was a student in the Turkish Land War Academy in Istanbul. Many of his Turkish classmates went on to distinguished careers as senior general officers in the Turkish Armed Forces. After graduation, Bob traveled extensively in Turkey, Cyprus, Greece, Pakistan, and Iran. He returned to the Pentagon, where he served as a current intelligence analyst in the Defense Intelligence Agency. In 1978, he was assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Ankara as the Assistant Army Attaché. After returning to the United States for battalion command, he was assigned to Turkey again in 1982 as the Army Attaché. He retired after 6 years of the faculty here at the Army War College in 1991. He has maintained an active interest in Turkey in the subsequent years and has participated in the meetings of the Friends of Turkey and Turkish American Council in Washington, D.C. He has returned to Turkey for visits, with the most recently in September of 2013. He maintains contact with several Americans who are still active in Turkish affairs and with a host of Turkish friends and retired military officers. Please welcome Bob Hervey to the podium.
Thank you, sir. Okay. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I see a number of friendly faces, and hopefully everybody will be friendly. I'm particularly pleased that İlker Can, the Turkish student at the Army War College, is here to join us today, and he can be a forceful critic perhaps afterwards. I would just do the advertisement first. Number one, I am an unabashed Turkophile. I am very fond of the Turkish people. I have found them to be warm and hospitable and fun-loving. And the face of Turkey is just absolutely terrific today. As Michael said, I was there in September, and the changes are phenomenal. The quality of the hotels and restaurants and shopping centers and traffic management and roads and tunnels and bridges has all just improved incredibly since I was last there 19 years before. So as an endorsement of the idea of going to Turkey and really enjoying the place, why I certainly I would give that endorsement. So let me talk for a while here. I think what I'm going to do is talk until about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, and we'll get a break. And then we will come back, and hopefully I won't have much more after that, and we can then go into a question and answer period. I'm going to cover a lot of material relatively quickly. If you have a pen and paper and want to ask a question, or if there's a part of this that you don't understand, by all means take a note or two, and then we can focus in on some of those issues after we get back after the break. Turkey just celebrated its 90th anniversary as a secular republic, October 29th of 2013. The republic was declared in 1923. It was declared as a secular republic. The modern-day founder of Turkey is this man, Mustafa Kemal. He is a combination of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson, John Wayne, you name it. He definitely has a very high profile in terms of the importance of his role in the founding of modern Turkey. He was a general officer during World War I in the Turkish army. He was particularly responsible for the defense of the Gallipoli Peninsula, the European side of the Dardanelles, and he defended the Gallipoli Peninsula against the British and French warships and the Australian and New Zealand infantry in that battle. That was the plan of the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, and Mustafa Kemal was successful in that effort, preventing the ships from getting through the Dardanelles and bombarding Istanbul and causing the Ottoman Sultan to capitulate. Nevertheless, Turkey did lose World War I and was on the wrong side, and Turkey was treated very, very badly in what is called the Treaty of Sèvres. And if that sounds like a French porcelain factory, that's exactly right, because that's where it was signed. But you can see what would have happened to Turkey if that treaty had gone into effect. Turkey would have been a relatively small part of the Anatolian Peninsula with a Black Sea coast only. The Italians, the French, the British, the Greeks, and the Armenians would have all had a very significant chunk of Turkey ceded to them. And that's what the Ottoman Sultan was forced to agree to. Mustafa Kemal was called by the Sultan and told to go out to eastern Turkey and disarm the last viable Turkish military unit in 1919. He went there, and instead of disarming them, he issued a call to arms and declared a war of national independence against the victorious Allies for the sole purpose of saving Turkey from this cut-up. He was successful after a 2.5-year war, particularly nasty little war. The British and the Italians never really fought. The French did a little bit, and the Greek forces were the principal adversaries in that war. After 2.5 years, Turkey, as I say, had won. Mustafa Kemal was victorious, and the boundaries of Turkey were established pretty much the way they are today as a result of that conflict. Then on October 29th of 1923, the Turkish Republic was established. Mustafa Kemal had a very Western focus in terms of his beliefs about the future for Turkey. The Grand National Assembly, which had met now in Ankara and not in Istanbul, and declared him president, elected him president, and he set about focusing Turkey in the direction that he wanted to go. Mustafa Kemal was not a Democrat. He did not solicit a significant amount of acquiescence from anybody, really. He kind of went on his own, but he obviously had a vision for Turkey of orientation toward the West. He said that we're not Arabs, we're not Persians, and he also had a unifying idea that everybody who lived in Turkey, regardless of ethnic derivative or religion, was in fact Turkish. And the principal problem with that focus was Islam. And he saw cultural Islam as a blanket on the people and on their progress, and he definitely believed that there ought to be separation between the mosque and the state. He abolished the caliphate, and he, of course, refused to accede to the Sultan, and he declared secularism as being a fundamental element of the Turkish society in one of his reforms. He outlawed the religious schools. He outlawed the Sufi sects, including the Mevlana sect, which you may have heard of, the Whirling Dervish sect. He forbid the fez. That's the brimless little hat that Sidney Greenstreet wore in Casablanca, for those of you who might. And he strongly discouraged the headscarf being worn by the women as a symbol of subservience to Islam. He did emancipate women. As far as education, he gave them full opportunity for education. He gave them right to own property. They could divorce for the first time, and eventually they even got the vote. So he was very advanced in that regard. His government was a one-party government, and he believed that that was all that was necessary at the time. Multi-party politics didn't come up until much later. The reforms which he instituted, he believed needed to be protected for the long term, and he chose the military establishment to do that. And he told the military, you are responsible to protect these reforms going forward. And then he told the politicians, and don't mess with the military. So that was both a curse and a blessing as a part of the foundation of Turkey, and I will explain that a little bit more than when we get further on. He also told the military to stay out of politics, which they probably didn't do very well. I went back and looked through some of Ataturk's speeches to try and find the specific charge to the military, and the closest I could come was a speech that he gave in 1938, just a few days before he died, actually, in which he charged the military to protect and defend against all enemies, external and internal. And that is probably the charge that the military took. Ataturk died in 1938, November 10th. His right-hand man, İsmet İnönü, took over for 12 years. He allowed multi-party politics to arise in the late 1940s, and when the first free elections, multi-party elections, were held in 1950, the party of Ataturk and İnönü lost. And a man named Adnan Menderes was elected. Menderes was a London-educated economist. He definitely had a Western orientation. Turkey participated in Korea immediately thereafter and joined NATO in 1952. Menderes stayed for 10 years. Toward the end of his time in office, he became increasingly autocratic and authoritarian, kind of words you might be hearing now, and he became soft on some of the secular strictures. For better or for worse, the first military intervention in the political structure of Turkey occurred in 1960. They basically terminated the government, reestablished what they considered to be an appropriate institutional oversight, and Mr. Menderes was executed. In 1963, multi-party politics again began. Now, I should just take a moment to say that multi-party politics in Turkey means multi-party. It's not a nice, clean left and right, Republican and Democrat. It has been oftentimes, basically factionalism at work, and small interest parties have arisen. The problem with that, of course, in a parliamentary system is putting together a coalition that can actually rule can be very difficult. Between 63 and 71, the left and right workers and students emerged, and a far-right militant nationalist group emerged, and the principal parties were unable to sustain that or to control that. And in March of 71, the military intervened for the second time. That was just before I got there, the first time. Again, the measures taken by the military at that time seemed inadequate. The political element took over again, Mr. Ecevit and Mr. Demirel, and continued to control politics up until 1980, when the years from 78 to 80, and I was there then, there were 10 assassinations a day. There were 9 Americans that were shot and killed. There were 5,000 deaths by just warfare on the streets. And finally, in September of 1980, the military intervened. And this time, it was a clean house. And they set up tribunals. More than 500,000 people were detained. 230,000 were tried and found guilty. Newspapers did not publish for 300 days. Almost all associations were halted in terms of operation. I would just say as a note about the 1980 intervention by the military that it was from that date that the intellectual elite in Turkey began to be less enamored of the military sticking their finger into the political pie, particularly because of the aftermath of the coup itself, in terms of the across the board, left, right, up, down, in and out arrests and prosecutions that were made. The business and educational professionals, and I can remember talking to a couple of professors from Istanbul University in 1983 and 84 who were very condemnatory toward the military's involvement. And frankly, it surprised me, but I began to understand that they thought that perhaps the days of military involvement in politics ought to be coming to an end. They did write a new constitution in 1982, which is still the law of the land with significant amendments, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. After the coup in 1980, Mr. Özal was elected prime minister in November of 1983, and he managed to get along with the Turkish generals fairly well, the military. He continued as prime minister until '89 when he was elected president, and then suddenly he died in 1993. And that was unfortunate because Mr. Özal was he did have a very good vision for Turkey going forward. Again, the multi-party politics reared its head. It got goofy as could be. I can remember attending a meeting down in Washington in 1996 where the far left and the far right were together, and they were forming a political coalition at that time, and I just never understood it, and it didn't work either. In 1997 was the last time that the military has particularly stuck their finger in. Some people consider that a coup in the sense that the government fell, but other people say it's not. It was a little controversial because what the military did in that time, and a good friend of mine was part of that operation, Javik Bir, and he and the National Security Council wrote a memorandum to then Prime Minister Erbakan and said, you have to agree to these particular measures and sign this memorandum. The first measure was the forbidding of the headscarf. You can see how important the headscarf was in the overall symbolic presence of Islam. But Mr. Erbakan signed it, but then resigned, immediately resigned. And that was the last time that the military has intervened. All right, that's kind of a little background that gets us up to date. I'm going to now talk to you extensively. If I can find my notes here, I will. About the current situation in Turkey and hopefully get to the challenges before the break. Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he's only 59 years old. He'll be 60 in February. Raised in a religious family in Istanbul. He attended the Imam Hatip, or the religious high school in Istanbul, graduated. He went on to Marmara University and earning an economics and business degree in 1981. Played professional football for a short time, not particularly successfully, but he entered politics almost immediately. And over the years, from 1981 to 1994, he was a member of a number of Islamic parties, all of which were ultimately banned by the government as being anti-secularist. His first prominence came in 1994, prominence as a politician. He was elected mayor of Istanbul, and everybody threw up their hands thinking that he was immediately going to install Sharia law as the law of the city. He didn't. He was actually a very good mayor of Istanbul. He appealed to a large mass of rural immigrants that had immigrated around the major cities, but they had lived in really primitive conditions around Istanbul. They were living in what were called gece kandus. You may have heard the term. He appealed to that group, He obviously had a religious background which appealed to that group of people, and he was elected mayor in 1994. He worked on water, sewer, and electric distribution and did that very well, traffic control, and he was hardcore construction development and getting modern buildings and modern constructions started. He was a good mayor, as I said. He made a mistake, however, in 1997, where his fundamentalist background came out, his Islamic background came out. He went to Siirt, which is a small town in southeast Turkey, and made a speech in which he said that the domes of the mosque should be our shields and the minarets of the mosque should be our bayonets, and we should defend Islam against the secularists. Boop, in jail. That's all that took. And he was sentenced to 10 months in jail. He actually only served about 4 months before he was released, and he immediately began organizing another political party, which came into being in 2001, and that's called the AKP, the Adalet ve Kalkınma Partisi, which means Justice and Development Party. And the AKP has been the dominant party in Turkey since 2002. In 2002, in the parliamentary elections, they won 43% of the popular vote, the largest plurality of any party since Mr. Özal's days. They also had a majority of seats in the parliament because of distribution rules with regards to the seats. In 2003, he was elected prime minister. He couldn't in 2002 because he was still banned from politics for his poem in Siirt, but that was lifted in 2003, and he became prime minister in 2003. His first term in 2003 through 2007 was very carefully engineered to focus on EU succession, European Union succession, and further development, kind of the same ideas he had when he was the mayor of Istanbul. He did not push an Islamic agenda at first in 2003. 2007, when he was reelected by an even larger majority, now 47% of the plurality, was the high point, perhaps, of his political career. In the aftermath of that election, the president's position in the government was becoming vacant, and because the president was elected by the parliament, and because the AKP was the majority party at that point in time, they selected a man named Abdullah Gül to be the president. President Gül, now President Gül, at that time, his wife wore the headscarf, and the idea to the secularists in the country and the military of a headscarfed wife in the presidential palace just did not set well. There were monster demonstrations, 300,000 in Ankara and a couple 100,000 in Istanbul, and the Turkish chief of the Turkish General Staff issued a warning. General Büyükanıt basically said that the current presidential election is challenging secularism. The military views this skeptically and with great concern and accepts its responsibility to protect the Turkish Republic and the reforms of Ataturk. Mr. Erdogan did not back down as Mr. Erbakan had previously. Instead, he decided to submit the whole process of electing the president to a national referendum, a constitutional referendum, an electoral referendum, in which he said from now on, the election of the president will be by direct vote, not by parliament. And he felt confident enough in the plurality majority of the AKP that he wanted this law to be passed, or this constitutional amendment to be passed. It did pass by 58% of the popular vote, a significant rebuff to the military and to the secularists, and basically establishing Mr. Erdogan in a very, very superior position. Subsequently, Mr. Gül was elected president, and frankly, in my opinion, he has served well. He had to resign from the AKP, from the political party, to be the president, because the president is supposed to serve outside of politics. The president doesn't really have political authority. The president has head of state responsibilities and representative responsibilities, but he does have some important appointment responsibilities, particularly with regards to the judiciary, and of course that's in the news today. Mr. Erdogan was irritated as could be by all of this goings on, and his agenda publicly changed. He was disgusted with Europe at that point in time because the European Union negotiations had gone nowhere, and of course, to join the EU, which I'll cover here in a minute, you have to have not only agreement on 35 different chapters of the Constitution of the European Union, but you have to have unanimous agreement from the current membership. A very difficult chore, to say the least. But by 2007, Mr. Erdogan was fed up with Europe and the EU, and as I'll talk about international relations here in a minute, he began to look for alternatives. In the meantime, as Mr. Gül, Mr. Davutoglu, who is currently the prime minister, but at that time was an advisor to Mr. Erdogan, began to provide him with input on an alternative foreign policy that was not focused on the West. Mr. Erdogan welcomed those conversations and began to consider them. The other thing that happened then is he began to say once and for all, we're going to get the military out of politics. He prepared another constitutional referendum, an amendment, which he submitted to the people in 2010. It was a multi-issue referendum, but one of the key points of that referendum was that the protections that were provided to the coup leaders, to the military coup leaders of the past, were removed. And, oh, by the way, Turkish military officers could be tried in civil courts for the first time. That passed, again, with about a 58% majority vote, a once and for all, as far as Mr. Erdogan was concerned, and most of the Turkish public, the military has been removed from the political scene. At the same time that that passed, there were a series of investigations launched into past military activity with regards to politics. They were called the Ergenekon and the Balyoz investigations. They came to fruition in 2012, and some 528 military officers were charged with sedition, treason, and terrorism. Those indictments carried forward investigations. There were trials of 531 military officers. 256 were sentenced. The sentences actually came down in August of 2013. And among others, 4 of my classmates at the Turkish Kara Harp Akademisi in 1972-73 were sentenced to life in jail. One of the reasons that I went in September was to try to determine the nature of that situation, so to speak, and it's still evolving. As far as the Islamization, the cultural and political Islamization, Mr. Erdogan proceeded to once and for all have the headscarf ban lifted. Girls in schools could wear the headscarf, and ultimately, women deputies in the parliament are now wearing the headscarf if they choose to want to do so. He banned alcohol sales after 10 o'clock at night. He spoke out against mixed dormitories of men and women and embarked on a program to segregate men and women in the university dormitories. His education program allowed students to begin their religious education much earlier than before. In the past, they had to do 8 years of elementary school before they could enter into the religious school, but now they only have to do 4 years. That's called the 444 program. Mr. Erdogan has unquestionably embarked on a cultural integration of Islam that is far-reaching. Now, before I go any further talking about Mr. Erdogan's program, there's another individual I need to talk to you about. I'm going to skip through a few slides. This is Hakan Fidan, who is the head of the Milli İstihbarat Teşkilatı, the CIA of Turkey, the MIT, the intelligence. He played a role in some of the foreign policy decisions. I'll get to that in a minute. This is Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Fidan with the President and the Secretary of State in May of 2013 in the White House. There's the headscarf in the Parliament, obviously being welcomed by. And you will note the headscarf is very definitive. It covers the hair, it covers the forehead, it covers the neck and shoulders, and then it's tucked into a trench coat in a very specific way, symbolic in its wear. I'll get to him in a little bit, and him too. That's İlker Başbuğ. This is the guy I want to talk about now. Okay, except for those of you who have heard me talk about this before, how many of you have ever heard of Fethullah Gülen? Okay. Well, he's a fellow Pennsylvanian. Lives right here in Saylorsburg, Pennsylvania. I don't think you probably know where that is. It's over near the Delaware Water Gap in the Poconos. He has an estate, a center for religious enlightenment. He has been variously described as a Muslim preacher, an Islamic scholar, as the leader of the largest transnational Islamic movement in the world, as a powerful business leader, and as an influential power broker. And I think he is probably all of those things. He has been in the United States since 1999. He was convicted in absentia of anti-secularism in 2000, and he chose not to go back. His green card was signed by a host of luminaries in the State Department and the CIA, which is a little bit of a problem for him right now. His religion is conservative, Sunni, in the Sufi tradition. He is a follower of Sayyid Nursi and the Nurju movement. Sufism began in Turkey in the 13th century. A man named Rumi, who came from Persia, he spoke about a manner of practicing Islam that was multidimensional, was not violent. It included welcoming other religions based on love of God as a first principle. And there is in Istanbul right now, right down at the end of İstiklal Caddesi, which is the main drag outside of coming down from Taksim, a wonderful Mevlana museum. I went to it in September. Couldn't believe it, but I mean, it was all in English, very well done. I'm not sure that Mr. Gülen might not have had a hand in that museum. Mr. Gülen began to exert influence through a series of sermons and so on in 1993, 94, By the time he left Turkey, he had established a very strong following. They perhaps as many as 10 million followers in Turkey who are a part of what is called the Jamaat or Hizmet. Hizmet translates to service, right, thank you. And Jamaat is community. He put together a consortium of journalists and business leaders, pious business leaders, particularly from Anatolia, and interestingly, apparently, had significant influence over the judicial elements of the Turkish government. He created a huge media empire. Zaman is the largest daily newspaper in Turkey, and the English version, today's Zaman, is read by anybody who follows Turkey, including me, literally every day. He has a television station, he has a news service, several internet news outlets, which is very important right now because this last week there was a bill to limit access to the internet. And he was a sponsor of dershanes, or schools that were particularly designed for people to be able to pass the university entrance examinations. These were schools that went on for a year or so after they graduated from high school, qualifying people, or at least giving them a shot at qualifying them to take the entrance examination into the universities. The headquarters are in Istanbul for Turkey. There's a conference center, and they bring people in from all over the world. Outside of Turkey, Mr. Gulen's followers are in 165 countries, and he has schools that he established through his network in all of them. He is the largest single charter school founder in the United States. 135 charter schools in 26 states, including Pennsylvania and Ohio, Texas, huge in Texas, of course that's a foreign country down there, but nevertheless. He has significant support from the federal government. He is viewed as a moderate, pro-U.S. Muslim with a huge following, exactly what has been called for within the context of confronting radical Islam. In the 1990s, like Erdogan, he was hounded and suspiciously followed by the secularists, particularly the military. But he had built a strong, influential network, and for a while he was able to resist all of that. But again, he was charged in 98 and tried in left for the U.S. in 99 and then convicted thereafter. Okay, I'm going to switch gear. You know a little bit about the background of Mr. Gulen and who he is and how powerful he is. We now come to what's going on in Turkey today, the current crisis. As you well know, I'm sure, in May and June, there were a group of tree huggers, for any other expression, who were trying to save a patch of trees in green just adjacent to Taksim Square in Istanbul that had been marked for the construction of all things, another shopping mall. This was the mayor of Istanbul and the prime minister, Mr. Erdogan, were very much in favor of doing this. A group of protesters, initially very well-meaning protesters, just said, wait a minute, we have so few trees left in Istanbul, they've paved everything, we're going to fight to try and save this little patch of green, which incidentally I walked across in September. It takes 90 seconds to walk. It's not Central Park. You can walk it 90 seconds this way and about 4 minutes this way and you're done. That's all it is. Unfortunately, the government responded vigorously against these protesters. Water cannons, tear gas, police with billy clubs. There was an enormous response, totally, in my opinion, unwarranted to the condition. That, of course, aroused other protesters who suddenly got interested in participating as preventing the park to be, and began to demonstrate against the Erdogan government for its authoritarianism and autocratic ways throughout the country. And the demonstrations went on for quite some time. The response from the government was very significantly a very tough response. They did not give in one iota. So they get past Gezi, and then in November, Mr. Erdogan announces that the dershanes, the schools that Mr. Gulen had all over Turkey that were providing this after high school education, were going to be closed. And in fact, they were going to be incorporated within the public school system. The break between Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Gulen kind of bubbled up at that point in time, and it began to be reported on in the news significantly. The current crisis. On December 17th, after purportedly a 2-year investigation, the police raided the offices and homes of 27 individuals very close to the Erdogan government, including the sons of 3 cabinet ministers. Pictures were shown on TV of huge boxes of money, safes in the living room that were stacked high, presumably full of money. And charges were brought against these individuals for graft, corruption, and money laundering. And the money laundering had to do with Turkey's buying oil from Iran with gold as defying the UN and US sanctions against Iran through the Halkbank, which is the People's Bank or the state bank. Mr. Erdogan responded to these charges definitively, saying this was a coup. This was an attempted coup. These corruption charges, regardless, this was an attempted coup by Mr. Gulen. And he threw in the Zionists for good measure. Mr. Gulen, as I said earlier, had extensive influence in the judiciary, particularly in the judiciary, the prosecutor's office, and the judges. And Mr. Erdogan responded by saying that those people were acting on orders from Mr. Gulen, and it was an attempt to bring down the Erdogan government. And he responded vigorously again. He transferred 1,200 police officers from their positions within a week. Ankara, Istanbul, Izmir, Diyarbakir, Adana. So far, 3,000 police officers have been moved. He also sounded a very defiant tone toward the prosecutors and the judges through their supreme counsel or high counsel, and said that they should not have the kind of authority to be able to do these things and the Justice Ministry or the Interior Minister not know anything about it. So he immediately issued a decree indicating that from now on, any charges against government employees would come through the Justice Minister or the Interior Minister first. The Justice Minister and the Interior Minister are members of the AKP. This is a parliamentary system, you have to remember. The High Council of Judges and Prosecutors immediately condemned it as anti-independent judiciary, and it was submitted to the Constitutional Court, where it was found unconstitutional. Mr. Erdogan never backed down an inch, continued to fight for the right of his government to control these investigations. A second wave of indictments were supposed to come forward, another 42 of them that included significant numbers of the major construction managers and owners in Istanbul, including the guy who was responsible for this third airport that's being talked about. And Mr. Erdogan simply defied that and did not allow the police to issue those charges and arrest warrants. And they have so far have not, including Mr. Erdogan's son, by the way, and they have not yet been issued. Both the EU, the European Union, and the U.S. have issued strong statements of concern about, number one, the charges need to be investigated, and number two, the need to maintain an independent judiciary. I will just tell you that as of this morning, there is a standoff. The Parliament is considering now a bill and or a constitutional amendment which would change the organization of the Turkish judiciary and give increased authority of the government to be able to control these kinds of actions. It would be a little bit like, this is not a great analogy, but it would be a little bit like the federal courts and the Supreme Court here being under control of the Justice Department. So that's the status as of this morning of the current crisis. By the way, the officers, the military officers who were sentenced and are in jail as a result of the trials in 2010 and 2012 have now gone back and said, wait a minute, if this prosecutorial team is tainted by Mr. Gulen's influence, they certainly were when they prosecuted us as well, and we should be released from jail, or at least retried. And that's also going on at the present time. The Ballos convictions were held up to this morning. Okay, so that's the current crisis. It's not a pretty picture. Let me see. You know what I think? Let's take a 15-minute break at this point in time. Give everybody a chance to get a glass of water, and then I'll finish up. We'll talk about foreign policy. Okay, I'm going to get started again because I want to leave some time for questions and answers. I'll zap you with my laser if you don't sit down. My weapon of choice here. I want to talk about the whole EU process, the European Union process a little bit, and then I'm just going to run over the world with regards to the foreign policy challenges, which obviously one of the things that you're most interested in, I would presume. And then we'll open it for questions and answers, okay? And I'm going to leave the map up from now on because somebody has asked that it be there as I talk about foreign policy issues. To accede to the European Union for a new nation to get into the EU, there are 33 negotiable laws of the EU Constitution that need to be agreed to by the board of the EU and then voted on by every single member of the EU, 28 nations. Thereafter, those same states then either agree or disagree. And if any one state disagrees, that nation does not become a member of the EU. I will tell you that I don't think Canada and the United States could get into the EU. And so it's a challenging process. And Mr. Erdogan was in Brussels on Monday night and Tuesday of this week and attempting to reassure the EU officials about the current crisis in Turkey, particularly the judiciary crisis, so that the negotiations for EU accession could go forth. Not really sure how successful he was in those conversations. Turkey has been an associate member of the EU since 1963, 51 years. A candidate for full membership since 1999. Accession negotiations actually began in 2005. It was frozen in 2006, and one chapter so far has been agreed to. Cyprus has frozen 6 chapters. France and Germany have frozen 4 chapters. There's no negotiations going on. The problem with Cyprus continues to be the fact that Turkey lopped off a hunk of northern Cyprus in 1974 and continues to control it. That's where the Turkish population in Cyprus lives. There was a plan to reunite Cyprus by Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and the Greek Cypriots rejected it. The Turkish, there were some problems with return of property. My opinion, Turkey will never be a member of the EU. I think that at this point in time, the negotiations are important, that they go forward. They are a democratizing effect on Turkey, and it does reflect, obviously, Turkey's financial status, economic status, because they are largely dependent on foreign investment, and a lot of that comes from Europe. But those same nations whose commercial entities invest significantly in Turkey, those same nations probably would not vote for Turkish accession to the EU, I don't think ever. Maybe it'll happen by 2023. That's the target that Mr. Erdogan set, and that's, of course, the 100th anniversary of the Turkish Republic. In a really good book by Robert Kaplan called The Revenge of Geography, Lance set me onto this book. He says, in the first decade of the 21st century, it became apparent that Turkey might never gain full membership in the EU. The reason was blunt and reeked of geographical and cultural determination. Though Turkey was a democracy and a member of NATO, it was also Muslim and therefore not wanted. So that's, I think, a very cogent argument with regards to EU accession. All right, let me switch to foreign policy. The book, and I know not a lot of you just got the book today or haven't had a chance to look at it. Professor Martin is an expert on Turkish foreign policy. Have you seen the book? I'll get you one. She gives a very, very good review of the situation on the ground. Now, Turkey has I think it would be fair to describe it as a tough neighborhood. Obviously, Syria and Iraq down here, Iran here, and whereas this used to be the Soviet Union, now is 3 separate independent states, all of who have competing interests, and obviously the problems between Armenia and Azerbaijan are significant. Their territorial disputes. Yes, sir.
Can add one thing. Still, the Armenian border is protected by Russian soldiers. There's a very big Russian establishment in Armenia, and the Armenian border is protected by the Russian soldiers.
But having said that, there have been some overtures on the part of the Erdogan government and from Armenia to actually sit down and talk. Not necessarily about 1915, but, Mr. Erdogan's response to that, actually, I kind of agree with. Let the historians figure that out. It doesn't make any difference in terms of the current context of relationships. But the problem is the fact that the Azeris and the Armenians are fighting about territory, and, of course, the Azeris are Muslim and the Armenians are Christian, and so Turkey naturally favors the Azeris. But nevertheless, there have been, the problem with Armenia, I mean, other than that, is the fact that the diaspora of Armenians that occurred after 1915, and about half of them, well, that's not fair. A lot of them ended up in Nancy Pelosi's district in California. And every year, she has submitted to the sense of the Congress a bill acknowledging Turkish genocide of the Armenians in 1915. Every year, the president and past presidents and future presidents and everybody comes down on Mrs. Pelosi not to proceed with it, and at the last minute, she pulls it. That's what she's done the last several years. It maybe satisfies the Armenian population in her district, but nevertheless, it's a huge issue the overall relationship between Turkey and Armenia. The biggest problem right now is Syria, by and away. And of course, I would say that's been a pretty big problem for us too. And it's a very long border. And the Syrians and the Turks have a history of not getting along very well. Going back to when that little piece of Turkey was lopped off, it's called Hatay province in 1938, by a vote of the population at that time, but it was a very close vote, and but it became part of Turkey. But the bigger problem right now is the fact that Assad al-Bashar Assad is a well, what should I say? I don't know how to describe him. Obviously, we want him gone too. And at one point, we were close to launching a significant missile strike against him after the chemical weapons had been used, and the Turks were 100% in agreement with that, and enormously disappointed, and that happened while I was there in September, that we didn't do it. And in fact, there were planning staffs meeting in Ankara at that very time, U.S. and Turkish planning staffs on how that was going to be carried out. Yesterday, at the Geneva II conference, the Syrian foreign minister stood up and said, if Mr. Erdogan hadn't stuck his finger into this thing, we wouldn't have all these troubles. That's kind of significant in terms of, and Mr. Davutoglu, the foreign minister, immediately reacted and said, that's kind of crazy, you know, considering what the history of the Assad regime has been in Syria. But at this point in time, the relationship between Turkey and Syria is very dangerous. And then, to make matters worse, the Kurds in northern Syria now are making noises about a similar regional independence, or at least autonomy, as it already exists in northern Iraq with the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government. And I haven't even talked about the Kurdish problem, but that's been going on for 35 years. I can just tell you that in 1984, I went to visit a friend of mine at the Gohani Hospital in Ankara, and I walked past a ward that looked very seriously like a ward in the immediate evacuation hospitals in Vietnam. There were a lot of war wounded in that ward. And that war has been going on. Perhaps as many as 40,000 lives have been lost in that war between the Kurdish separatists and the Turkish government and Turkish military. But that is a part of the dimension of Iran to some extent, not quite so much Iraq and Syria. The current crisis with Iraq has to do with oil. Turkey has negotiated, and there is now a pipeline operating between the Kurdistan Regional Authority and Turkey. Well, one part of the agreement after the U.S. was pulling out was that all oil sales would go through Baghdad. These sales are not going through Baghdad, and it's a near crisis at the moment. The Turks are kind of standing back and saying, wait a minute, it's your problem. You guys solve it and work it out. But it really is part of Turkey's problem as well. So that's the immediate crisis with Iraq. Amazingly, the most success that Mr. Davutoglu has had in his foreign policy adventures, and Mr. Fidan, who is the MIT guy, the CIA guy, as a part of this, has been enormously successful in creating certainly a commercial relationships. Turkey buys 42% of its oil from Iran. And there is some simpatico kinds of relationships too. That has to do somewhat with the fact that Turkey's relationship with Israel are so awful at the present time. Iran is supporting Mr. Assad in Syria. I mean, this is Byzantine, folks. I mean, this is bureaucratic stuff that's if you put this together on a line chart, you'd be a series of circles is what it would be. But the Iranian government is supporting Mr. Assad. Obviously, Turkey is not. But nevertheless, Mr. Davutoglu and the Iranian foreign minister act like long-lost buddies every time they get together, and they get together frequently. So Iran, fairly positive at the moment, despite the difference on Syria. Iraq in the state of crisis. Syria in a definitive state of crisis. Armenia and Azerbaijan kind of holding their own. Georgia is just buying stuff from Turkey like crazy, refrigerators and stoves and all kinds of commercial products. Now, interestingly, right, I haven't even mentioned Greece. Greece and Turkey, traditional problems. Not now, not right now. There seems to be an accommodation. There's quiet in the Aegean, which is out here, which there's lots of issues in the Aegean that have never been resolved, that continue to exist. But for whatever reason, I think the Greeks, their current financial situation is so dire that they are just concentrating on getting their house in order as best they can, and they don't need any problems with Turkey at the present time, and kind of vice versa. The other issue is Cyprus, and as I said, it's a huge issue in the EU, and I made the comment to Ilker during the break. I said, if Turkey had to make a choice between the EU or supporting Northern Cyprus, they'd support Northern Cyprus, period. They are not going to abandon the Turkish population in Northern Cyprus. The history of the 1974 invasion would be another lecture, and I don't have time to go into that. So. And lastly, Israel. Well, no, not lastly. I've also got Egypt. But Israel, 40 years relationship between Turkey and Israel, excellent relationship, commercially, militarily, close relation, and intelligence-wise. There was an intelligence exchange program that was very useful for both. Mr. Erdogan and Mr. Davutoglu, within the context of their Middle Eastern-oriented foreign policy, after they became disappointed with the EU and the West, began to support, for better or for worse, Hamas in the Gaza. And Mr. Davutoglu got personally involved in some negotiations. The Israelis responded to that badly, I guess, and Mr. Erdogan met Shimon Peres in Davos in 2010 and took him to task. It's a picture in your book, actually, of that confrontation. And then, that was 2011, I think. And then, of course, the non-governmental organization in Turkey sought to provide aid, humanitarian aid, to Gaza, to Hamas, and a ship named the Mavi Marmara was leading a convoy in that direction, and the Israelis, in their usual ham-handed fashion, dropped rangers or commandos onto the deck of the ship and killed 9 people on the ship. And the Turks have never forgiven the Israelis for that yet, although there is a negotiation going on now for compensation. So it's not swell in Israel either. And then finally, Egypt. Mr. Erdogan was a strong supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood when they overthrew Mr. Mubarak and Mr. Morsi was elected. This was a great victory for Islam and for the whole idea of Islam taking and operating a government. Of course, within a year, Mr. Morsi had become a force of significant controversy, I guess is the best way to put it. And the generals overthrew him. And immediately, Mr. Erdogan condemned that action and has continued to condemn it because he was not real fond of the military getting involved in politics himself. And they've withdrawn their ambassadors at this point in time. There's no Turkish ambassador in Egypt and vice versa. So the foreign policy dimension of Turkey's current situation is challenging, to say the least. A couple other challenges. Elections coming up. Local elections the end of March. Presidential elections, the first direct election of the president, coming up at the end of August. Mr. Erdogan cannot run for prime minister again in 2015. He's only 59 years old. He's going to run for president, almost certainly, in August. He can do that while he's still prime minister, which is kind of goofy. What role does that leave for Mr. Gül? Don't know. Could he become the prime minister in 2015? I don't know. Where will Mr. Gülen throw his support in the entire dimension of, if the AKP is the only conservative Muslim party, where does Mr. Gülen go? He doesn't have a political party. He doesn't have a political structure. Never has had, and has declared that he never will have. But he may have 10 million votes in Turkey that he controls. So, and the current status of relations between Mr. Gülen and Mr. Erdogan is not very good, as I've already told you. So the elections coming up, and then parliamentary elections are scheduled in 2015, but they may come early. They can be called early. I've already talked about the economy, and I think I've kind of talked about the PKK, the Kurdish terrorist group, for want of a better description, that operates cross-border from Iraq and Syria. In 1998, Turkey was ready to go to war with Syria because they were protecting Öcalan, who was the head of the PKK. They finally expelled him in 1999, Mr. Öcalan, and he went to Nairobi, and he was there for 1 week, and the Mossad policed him up, handed him to the CIA, who rendered him to Turkey, and he's now sitting on an island in the Sea of Marmara, and he'll be there for the rest of his life. And you thought Jason Bourne was a fictional character, right? So far, the democratization program, which Mr. Erdogan was putting forward as an attempt to mollify the Kurdish population, which is huge, which is somewhere between 15 and 20 million people in southeastern Turkey, right down here, has not been well received. But so much else is going on at the moment that you would think that probably Mr. Erdogan doesn't have time to focus on that the way he should be focusing on it in terms of resolving that 45-year issue.